Hi everyone, welcome. We're down here in my wormery and I'm preparing to check in on these two bins right behind me. There are a couple of worm bins that have European nightcrawlers living in them, and the older bin, they're not the same age, the older bin is now 350 days old. The younger bin is only a couple weeks behind, so they're pretty old. In fact, at 350 days of age, the older one is only a couple weeks shy of hitting a year old. And the younger bin, it's only a few weeks behind at 326 days of age. And as you can see, the worms are getting a little bit restless. I could see one crawling on the surface right over there. And unfortunately, I've even seen a number of worms starting to die out on the surface, coming out to the surface and just drying up out there. So now after 46 days of foraging, what I consider foraging, 46 days ago was the last time we fed these systems. So that means foraging is just the worms cruising through the material, picking off any leftover scraps of bedding or food that remain. I think they're due. I think they're ready to be extracted from their castings and relocated into nice new fresh bins. Bins that I built for them quite a while ago at this point. 29 days ago, these fresh systems have been sitting around waiting for new occupants. And there is kind of a novelty item in the younger system over here. It was well over 200 days ago we placed a compostable bag into the younger system over here. And now that the worms are going to be cut loose in new environments, we're going to get that compostable bag back into service and pick up where we left off as far as its decomposition process. So I'm going to get these systems up on the bench. I'm also going to get my screener out here because I intended to screen this material to separate the worms from their castings. And then we're going to release them into their new home. So let's get to work. Now, before my hands get all dirty, I thought I'd share some of this information with you on my information board. So like I said, the older system that we have out on the bench already here is the 350-day-old system. And this little number up here indicates how many times the system was fed over its lifetime, 30 times. And the younger system was fed 25 times. And I think most of this was covered already too, 46 days since we initiated the foraging process. And like I said, the compostable bag, 208 days in progress now, from which I think it's fair to subtract the 46 days of foraging, since at that point in time we pretty much kind of removed the compostable bag from the line of fire and pretty much drew its composting activity to a screeching halt. And then I think I also made mention of the fact that the new bins that I created for these little guys 29 days ago have just been sitting around waiting for new occupants. And earlier, prior to starting the filming, I came in here with some foods and prepared those bins with some foods for them. So this pile of stuff here, I did come in here on a couple occasions off camera, and every time I would come in here I would sort of aerate the material, sort of stir it up and bring the more damp stuff up from the bottom and submerge the more dry stuff that's down low. And at that time I kept pulling out all these little bits of what I suspect are potato peels. So I assume that we probably fed potato peels kind of late in the game, and they just never really got to the point where they were nibbled away. Perhaps the material in here got a little bit too dry, and perhaps these pieces of food just didn't get broken down because of the absence of sufficient moisture to help the worms break down their food. So I gradually tried to clean this material of any sort of residue and debris so that it would be a really smooth process to get it cleaned up. So my idea was to simply take all of this material as well and bring it with the worms over into their new home so that they could pick up where they left off on polishing off these potato peels. And I believe these are just the skins of some cherry tomatoes. This object here is the stem of a pumpkin, and this is just another chunk of pumpkin stem. So we'll do a similar extraction of the stuff from the other system to get it out of there before we begin. So as you can see, the worms have been tunneling down deep into the material to get to where the material is nice and damp still, because by being subject to the air, the top surface here has grown quite dry. And once in a while, a worm will surface and find itself on that really dry material, and then, regrettably not be able to get back down to where it's safe and just die out there on the surface. Luckily, there weren't too many casualties of that sort, but it is always sad to see when it happens. So, in the past, when I've done this method of separating the worms from their material using my screen, the process is kind of repetitive, so I'll usually just play it back in fast motion. But basically, it consists of me filling up this screen, shaking it so that all the castings end up down in the red bucket, and presumably the majority of the worms will get caught in the screen, and then I'll empty the screen, meaning, place the worms into this little container here to collect them up, and then we will have, for the most part, separated the worms from their castings. But I do imagine that there's probably some worm cocoons remaining in this material that probably need time for the worms to emerge. And then I'm also assuming that we're going to also, have a whole bunch of little tiny baby worms that fall through the screen. So the game plan was to kind of run a little bit of a cocoon nursery environment so that there's time for the cocoons in the castings to hatch, and then we would try to bait those baby worms out of the material at some point prior to really considering the castings as harvestable. So I've gone a little while here shaking, but I don't want to go berserk doing so because, yeah, you could see quite a number of worms fall through and end up in the castings. So there will be a good number of worms that need to be collected up, I suppose, in the end, with some sort of a baiting process in the finished castings. I'll just combine all that material into a single container and then set up some sort of a baiting box to try to round up all the ones that fell through the screen, or any newborns that come out of cocoons that fell through the screen as well. But I guess the whole idea by doing it this way was to just try to do it quick, and minimize the amount of time it takes to separate the worms from their castings so that we can get them launched off into a new home. Yeah, quite a few worms fall through doing it this way, but that's fine. It was anticipated, and I guess the tail end of it is going to be setting up a bait box to round up those worms that didn't get isolated from their castings using this process. So it's usually at this point that I try to spare you of the repetitive activity and kind of run the video back at fast speed, just so we can get to the point in time when this is finished and we can move on to the next to continue with that one. Okay, so I guess this is the point where I've got to institute a little process of quality control, mainly to make sure any little wormies that slipped out of the process and ended up here on my paper tablecloth don't remain stranded and dry off. But I believe we've got them all, and I'm fairly certain that the black container that they used to live in is free of worms too. But I'm going to take a quick look through everything here to make sure we haven't left any little wormies behind. And over here, as you can see, we've got an entire bucket full of beautiful castings with a whole bunch of worms in it, which are going to get, rounded up at a later point in time using some sort of a baiting process, which we'll set up after we've emptied all this material into sort of a common place where all the material from both bins is going to be positioned. So I think we're ready to get on to bin number 2, the younger system. All right, we're ready to start into Act 2, which is really just a repeat of Act 1 with very little variation, with the exception that in the younger bin, there was this unusual object, the compostable bag, and in most cases we didn't really have much of an opportunity to take a close look at this thing to see what kind of progress it's been making, but now we have a chance to sort of examine it a little bit more closely. I mean, if I had to estimate how many days worth of wear there are on this thing, I would have to estimate it that it's somewhere in the 160 days range, right? Because, if it was placed in here 208 days ago, but we want to subtract 46 days from that because that was the composting time frame, then, the foraging time frame, then that seems like a realistic amount of time. So I think it will be realistic to deduct a certain amount of time from the elapsed duration of the bag going in up until the point where we decide that it is in fact fully composted and gone, although I don't know how that's going to play out. If this thing starts breaking up into little pieces, and if we're confident that it will just eventually all go, then we could just leave it in here, and, well, not in here, but in the new system, where it's going to get put back in alongside the worms to continue. But if we start getting that feeling that it's just going to turn into litter throughout the system, and then maybe this stuff isn't going to break down, I don't know. We're going to have to play that by ear and see how that plays out. So, a little bit more of the same. We might just end up playing this back in fast motion as well, because it's really just more of the same sort of stuff we just did in the older bin. Screening the material, trying to separate the wormies so that we can get them relocated into their new home. Now, I guess my one observation in the other system was that the worms were accompanied by a fair bit of compost, which I imagined more of passing through the screen, but there are these little chunks which don't go through the screen, and I thought there'd be a lot less of that, to be honest. So we are bringing a good bit of finished material along for the ride with the worms into their new home, because I don't really intend to separate that stuff from the worms, although I suppose using some sort of a light separation process it would be possible to sort of skim those little boulders off the top and let the worms dive down gradually until such a time that we've managed to, remove more and more of that stuff from the pile of worms. But whether or not we want to take the time to do that or not, I don't know. I'm going to have to decide. So let's try to pick up the pace and get this job wrapped up. right, well, for the most part we're done here. I've just spent the past few minutes removing worms from the screen. I did that over in the container that I had emptied the first batch of material into from the red bucket. And I noticed over here around the workspace there were still a couple worms who had fallen onto the tablecloth. But I think for the most part, like I said earlier, we've managed to separate the worms, or at least a good number of them, from their castings. And in order to get the last of these little guys, you know, separated from the material that is intended to get harvested at some point in the near future, these beautiful castings, I've got this bait box that we're going to use to try to lure them out of the material. And it's really just a clear box with a bunch of holes in it. Now that box is this one right here. It's just a plastic tray with a whole bunch of holes on it, and then I'll rest that on top of the material that the worms are still living in. I'll equip it with a whole bunch of nice damp bedding, perhaps a few tasty morsels to attract them into it. And then at some point in the future, hopefully not too far down the road, we'll end up with a whole bunch of material that's been fully evacuated with some worms that we can reunite with their friends and neighbors. So I think the next step is clear. Besides emptying this into the container to be baited, we've got a whole bunch of little wormies to release into their new home. Let's get to that now. So now the environment that these little guys are going to be released into is these two newly built systems. Well, not newly built, because like I mentioned earlier, they were built and prepared for these little worms more than 4 weeks ago, 29 days ago. And they've just been sitting around for the future point in time at which we're going to be able to bring the worms over into here and release them. But I built these systems with no food in them, so earlier today I came down with some frozen vegetables and placed that stuff down right beneath the surface for them, and that included even a little bit of coffee, which means we've got ourselves a couple feeding zone indicators on the ready to be used when these systems are all set to be put back up on the shelves. And for me, the coffee filters serving as feeding zone indicators just show me where the food was positioned, and that's going to be right down the middle. And that's pretty much where we're going to drop the worms. But before we do that, there's a little bit of unfinished business here as far as stuff that needs to also be... Yep, now you can see some of the food, right? It's not very deep below the surface. But I also wanted to submerge some of this stuff that came over from their old environment. So there was this little landing pad that we positioned some of the stuff that I'd been collecting over time when I was aerating the bins. I'm fairly certain that what we're putting in here is potato peel. And it is kind of unusual that the potato peel didn't get consumed by the worms over time. But I guess now that we're going into brand new bins with this stuff, there's going to be plenty of time for this stuff to get broken down. And as far as the compostable bag goes, I believe bin number 1, or at least the one here to your left, is the one that I'm going to mark as bin number 1. And as long as we've got sort of a novelty item in bin number 1 with the compostable bag, let's put this piece of pumpkin stem into what's going to become bin number 2. So basically, when I've got systems that are launched on the same day, I give them numbers so that I can distinguish one from the other. So since both of these bins are going to be, oh, you know what, let's also place this down here near where the foods are, so that it's in a place where hopefully it's going to see some nice worm traffic and continue the breakdown process. So yeah, I'll typically just number bins 1 and 2, or whatever, 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever the number of bins there are. when they're launched on the same day. These little labels that you see over here, they're just indicators to show that this is a separate series of numbers. The number that I have is actually written underneath the handle, so either I need a mirror or something to see what's under there. So I put a little label on here to show me that, you know, bin number 1 is going to become what in my inventory is known as bin number 2, and bin number 3. Those are numbers that I normally don't really include in day-to-day discussions about the systems. So the last thing to happen here, other than the to-do items that I've got to take care of later, such as cleaning up and baiting the compost, is to release our worms. And I thought about how to do this in the most simple, straightforward way. And it seemed to me that perhaps if I just go one handful at a time, I should be able to pretty evenly distribute the material. And at this point, it's not even material we're distributing, it's the worms, right? So I'm going to go one handful at a time and give each system one handful at a time. And as always, I'm going to be looking to you guys as the viewers to provide me with input on just how many worms we released here today. So hopefully everyone will leave a comment to indicate to me how many worms they believe we're releasing into these systems. I usually strive to do this in a way that, you know, releases the worms in equal numbers into the systems so that, you know, each system has an equal number of worms and that we can just treat these as sort of twin bins having equal populations. But sometimes that just doesn't quite work out, or at least the viewers don't seem to think that that's the way it played out. So sometimes I get disparate numbers. Oops. Got to put one more over there to keep it even, right? So sometimes it does seem like more worms end up in one or the other systems, and then the feedback I get from the viewers and the comments indicates it that way. So if you think that both systems did get an equal number of worms released into them, then just give me whatever that number is and let me know that that's the number that applies to both bins. But if you feel strongly that what we ended up with here is one bin that has perhaps a greater number of worms released into it, then please specify how many worms you believe were released over here into what's going to become bin number 2. I mean, bin number 1. It's actually bin number 2 in my inventory, but it's going to be labeled as bin number 1. And this one over here, closer to me, is going to be labeled as bin number 2. So perhaps one more handful per system to go here. That's about right. So I usually like to spread the worms out pretty evenly across the surface of the material so they've all got equal access to the bedding below so they can squirm out of the bright lights and take cover. So let's let them get settled, and please don't forget, leave me a comment. You know, the majority of the worms have made themselves at home, so I think it's time to bring an end to this fun little process of getting the worms out of their old environment and into their new. Just wanted to get their systems covered back up, get them out of these bright lights. They've been through a lot today, so I think it's time to let them rest and get them out of the spotlight here, literally, because worms don't like the bright lights. You would have thought that more of them would have, you know, retreated down into the material below them. Some of them were just a little bit curious and wanted to continue exploring what was going on. So, like I said, I'm really looking forward to hearing what people have to say, but don't refer to these as bin number 2 and 3 as you see in these little unusual temporary labels that I put out here. What we're really going to be considering these worm bins as are ENC systems number 1 and 2. And to correspond with that, I've done what we always do, is I've created a couple of labels. So please join me in welcoming the 2 newest systems to my wormery. European Nightcrawler System number 1, European Nightcrawler System number 2. And based on everyone's feedback, I'll update my tracking spreadsheet to show exactly how many worms live in these. So please don't forget to leave me a comment. Please let me know how many worms you believe occupy these systems, and then I'll be tracking that information accordingly. So I've got some cleanup work to take care of over here. I've got some bins to clean out. I've got to create a nice little baiting mechanism to place on top of the castings that we know are full of worms. I've even got a number of worms that I need to release into here. But you know what? Why don't we leave it at that? Alright everyone, thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.